In this video, we're going to be talking about the shocks on the Sakura D6. How we're going to make them a little bit more useful, especially in the rear. A couple kind of fun modifications that I'm playing with, plus some just basic stuff that you're going to want to do to all the shocks on the Sakura D6 in order to free it up and make it work better. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Troy. This is RoadsideRC. You'll tend to find me bashing or crawling or drifting or racing, plus doing product review videos and how-tos. And I've been having some fun with this Sakura D6, but the factory shocks leave a little bit to be desired. And so what we're going to talk about is one kind of no-brainer that everybody needs to be doing with these shocks in order to make them work better, but then something that I'm experimenting with. I wasn't initially going to make a video on this, but I had a couple people kind of ask me in the same kind of questions, and so this is an easy way to answer it. Let's get started with the no-brainer, everybody must do it, part one. These factory shocks, no matter how you build them, appear to be very sticky, and if you follow the Sakura D6 Facebook owners group, you will find that the Yokomo blue O-rings, those are the common ticket to solving this. Even no matter what I did with those factory black O-rings in there, they would always stick. And once you got it moving, they'd move a little better, but they'd still a little bit sticky. Once you get these blue O-rings in there, they work much better. Now, there's some Rev D O-rings that people have used with good success. I actually have these kind of clearish, whitish O-rings. I don't know if you can see them in there. Yeah, kind of hard to see them in the camera, but there's some clearish, whitish ones in this package. I think they're like old MST ones or something. I put them in there. They also, in one of the shocks, they also work really well. Here's a picture of the factory black O-ring versus the blue. I think those black ones are just too big and they end up pinching. So that part's the no-brainer. That's the part and that makes it immediately work dramatically better. But what I want to really focus on here today is actually on the rear, and it's really more about the suspension travel. With the factory shocks, even with some preload, you don't end up sitting very high up. Now, I do have some different springs on here that I'm messing with, so I'm sitting even lower than I normally would. But what problem really comes in is the factory springs for my setup, with my battery, with my body. The factory springs were just a little bit too hard, and the car sat up at the top of the shock travel all the time. That's bad. It doesn't mean you don't get much in the way of suspension movement. I like my springs and shocks to sit somewhere down in the middle so that as they hit bumps on the track, it can move both up and down. But what you end up with is just millimeters down here. My chassis is currently setting, it's about 4 millimeters off the ground. That's not a lot. So as you move and as the car drives, it's really likely to do that and hit the ground. Where every time you hit the ground, you unload the tires and you lose traction. That is bad. Here's another example of trying to show you what I'm talking about. So I've just chalked the rear wheels up here on some additional wheels. I want to be able to use, while I drift, the full shock travel. And as I come down here, which you'll see, if it's really easy to see, it's like this bottom plate can come, it's like 5 or 6 millimeters. I mean, it's like 5+ millimeters down below the bottom of those wheels that can come down. One last way of showing this. Chassis is bottomed out. Look, I can still pull the rear wheel up. And if I leave it just down there, yep, that's like 8 millimeters that wheel can come up. Boop, after the chassis is already on the ground. So my whole thought here is, how can I readjust the rear suspension so that I can actually use all of that travel? So I've already done one thing trying to counteract this, which is I have actually unscrewed these rod ends off the shock. I've actually unscrewed them about 3 millimeters. What that's doing is making the total shock longer, trying to give myself a little bit longer of a shock to start with, so I'm not shock limited on the upside. But it's not enough. And while I'm at it, you'll also notice that I've already been running some little spacers in here. And that's to stand that shock up a little bit more. So what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to move this shock mounting position down and out. I have designed and 3D printed a little bracket that's an adapter here. It will screw on to this part using a factory kind of screw up here into the regular shock tower, and then gives a location down here for that ball stud to screw into. It should lower this total shock mounting position down somewhere around 8 millimeters, and it will stick it out about 10 millimeters from factory. I think we're finally starting to get somewhere now. Look at this. Car has good, nice, smooth, too much movement in the front actually, maybe. I may need to actually soften the springs or thicken the oil up a little bit in the front, but in the rear, nice, easy movement. I ended up modifying my little kind of shock offsets here. I shortened them up just a little bit. I took about 4 millimeters out of them, compressed them up just a little bit. I had one fatal flaw in my plan, which is there's only so much up travel. And I was like, why am I getting so little up travel after I've done all of these changes? Well, pretty simple. As it turns out, the control arm actually hits the chassis. Yep. It bottoms out on the chassis really, really easy. So, what's really important here, I've seen a couple people modifying these online by putting some shims, some washers in underneath the control arm, raising that control arm up, and then that gives it some more clearance. I could clearly come in here and grind some down on the chassis. That would also allow the control arm to move more. Heck, I could grind a little bit on the control arm itself if we wanted to. I'm not going to do any of those just yet. For now, I have a dramatically softer spring on here than what came from the factory. With these standoffs and the dimensions that we have here, now as the spring fully compresses, it fully compresses like a 0.5 millimeter before the chassis hits. The chassis is no longer the limiter on the down travel, but we still have it a little bit here on the up. The good news is, with these springs that I've now swapped over to, I still do have up travel though, so especially with the body on. So battery in, body on, the car can go down and up. So it'll set naturally a little bit lower, a little bit in droop, and then we do have opportunity for the suspension to move both ways. That is great. That's what suspension is supposed to do, actually. Remember, as we started all of this, that the factory springs were, according to my spring rate gauge over here, 6.4 stiffness. I went through the whole MST 32mm 820108 soft spring set, and I went all the way down 5.36. I was actually pretty happy with these, but once I made my new adjustments, I could go even just another step softer. So 820110 extreme soft. The hardest set in the extreme soft is a 4.37 pink gold on the MST there. So that is currently what's on the car. Went all the way from a 6.4 to a 4.3. The car sits down in the suspension a little bit. I think we've made something good. Let me give it a quick run here on my home drift track just to see what I notice. I can immediately tell that under power the car clearly has more movement. I see the rear squatting, I see the front lifting. It's not excessively, so I'm pretty happy about that. I thought maybe it'd be too much. Car's very predictable. Any of that situation I had before where it would lose traction, bottoming out is gone. That is awesome. This is so much better. Those blue O-rings, shock swap, at a minimum, if you could just do those. If you absolute bare minimum, I think it's mandatory you do the blue O-rings. But even if you can swap over, depending on how heavy your car is, if you can swap over to some lighter springs on the rear, that seems to be a really good thing. And then I'll make that 3D print file for the shock standoff. I'll make that available online. And that way people can grab that if they need it. Oh, that's fun. This is good. Let's try to get some close-ups and see what it looks like. Looking at the slow motion footage, this is definitely better. There's no question. The front is a lot more active still, but it has a lot less weight to hold and a lot less to do up there. Front is still very, very active. The rear is still just a little bit stiff with all of that in there. I don't know, maybe I've gone to slightly too soft of a spring. I guess these are the kind of things that we could still kind of mess with and figure out. But the good news is we have the shock spring tester. We have all the shocks labeled. We know now a couple little tricks that will make this whole chassis really come alive, and that is the most important part. Now clearly I need to continue to play with this car, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Anything that I do is going to be in my Sakura D6 playlist. That'll be popping up over here to your right in a playlist. If otherwise you're curious about these springs, that spring tester, even those parts that I have 3D printed, there'll be links to each one of those down in the video description, and I hope you'll take advantage of those. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.